morning, New City family. My name is Lisa Carter, and I'll be sharing our scripture today, which comes from Romans chapter 11, verses 25 through 36. I want you to understand this mystery, dear brothers and sisters, so that you will not feel proud about yourselves. Some of the people of Israel have hard hearts, but this will last only until the full number of Gentiles comes to Christ. And so all Israel will be saved. And as the scriptures say, the one who rescues will come down from Jerusalem, and he will turn Israel away from ungodliness. And this is my covenant with them, that I will take away their sins. Many of the people of Israel are now enemies of the good news, and this benefits you Gentiles. Yet they are still the people he loves, because he chose their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For God's gifts and his call can never be withdrawn. Once you Gentiles were rebels against God, but when the people of Israel rebelled against him, God was merciful to you instead. Now they are the rebels, and God's mercy has come to you, so that they too will share in God's mercy. For God has imprisoned everyone in disobedience, so he could have mercy on everyone. Oh, how great are God's riches and wisdom and knowledge. How impossible it is for us to understand his decisions and his ways. For who can know the Lord's thoughts? Who knows enough to give him advice? And who has given him so much that he needs to pay it back? For everything comes from him and exists by his power and is intended for his glory. All glory to him forever. Amen. This is the word of God to the people of God. Please be seated.
Amen. Thank you, Lisa. Well, good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? Good. Woo. Yes. First off, special welcome to all the kids we have in the room. There's a lot in here, more than usual. So glad to have you guys with us. We're excited that you're here, and glad you're with us. As we get into, before we jump into this morning, I just want to take a moment to remember, since we are in Memorial Weekends and tomorrow being Memorial Day, to take a moment to remember those who have fallen, those who have given their lives, who have sacrificed themselves for us, for our country, for what we have, and we just remember and we honor those who have sacrificed so much for us. As we jump into this morning, we've been in Romans for several months now, and if we wanted to, we could break down Romans into three different sections. And so the first section would be chapters 1 through 8. And this question that Paul is working through and asking in chapters 1 through 8 is, how do we become right with God? And Paul is very clear in chapters 1 through 8 that everybody has fallen short of God's glory, and that everybody needs something outside of ourselves, both Jew and Gentile. We are in desperate need for someone else, something else to come and to make us right with God. And as he works through it, he says that, there's bad news for Jew and Gentile alike because we're separated from God. But the good news is that God has made a way. God has made a way for us to be made right with him, and it is all through Jesus. And it's what Jesus has done for us through his life and his death and his resurrection. And the best news is all we have to do to receive that is to accept it in faith, to trust in what Jesus has done. And that there is the way. This is the way for all of us to receive faith, to receive salvation, and to be made right with God. And he continues to work through it and say, this is what those things mean. This is what it means to be in Jesus, to be united with him in his death, in his resurrection, that we live in newness of life, that we walk in newness of life with Jesus. And even though we still struggle, this is Romans chapter 7, we still struggle with the sin that's within our flesh, battles the spirit. But Paul goes on to say in Romans 8 that we can We can live in the power of the spirits. And not only have we been legally justified as forgiven and in right standing with God because of what Jesus has done, but we have also received a spirit of adoption that now says that, we don't just belong to God, we are actually sons and daughters of God. We belong to his family. We've been brought in this way. And that if this is true, which it is, there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God that we find in Jesus. And so Paul takes, 8 chapters to work through that. In the last few weeks, we've been sitting in chapters 9, 10, and 11. And the question that we're working through here is, how does God work in salvation? Which we'll come to in a minute. But next week, we'll jump into the final section, how we've broken down Romans. And that's what we'll be going through the rest of the summer, chapters 12 through 16. And it looks at, how do righteous people live? What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus, to be made right with God? How does that impact my life? And that's what Paul focuses on in those chapters. But in chapters 9, 10, and 11, Paul takes a moment to stop and just ask some really deep questions. Because this is some of Paul's deepest, most theological works in anything that he's written. But he's writing a lot. He's asking deep questions. He's quoting from the Old Testament so much. He's bringing the Old Testament law in to show how what God has done in and through Jesus is true. And then he's specifically asking the question, what does this mean then for the Jews? So chapter 9, he's talking about God's magnitude and God's majesty and God's mystery. We can't fully wrap our arms around the bigness of who God is, but we know that God is kind and we know that God is merciful. And we see Paul's heart for his Jewish brothers and sisters when he says, man, I wish more than anything that I could trade places with them. If they could know what I know about Jesus, I wish I could trade places with them so that they, could understand this and know the blessing and the promises that have been revealed in Jesus. And last week we talked about how, Paul's prayer, his heart and his prayer was for Israel to be saved. And he prayed that to God. Paul is wrestling with this question. If Jesus is the answer, the Messiah, the one that they've waited for, then why have so few Jews responded? What do we make of their lack of response? And he begins chapter 11 with the question, has God rejected Israel? Is that what we're to make of this? Has God rejected his chosen people, the people that were, his prized possession in all of the earth? Has God rejected them? And Paul answers with an emphatic, absolutely not. God has not forgotten his people. And Paul goes on in the first few verses here to list out a few different arguments as to why this isn't true. And his first argument is himself. Paul says, verse 1, I ask then, has God rejected his own people, the nation of Israel? Of course not. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, and a member of the tribe of Benjamin. Paul uses himself to make this first argument against the idea that God is the one who's rejected his people. He's saying, I was a hardened person against Jesus. I was opposed to Jesus. I was opposed to his people, but God reached me. And if God has not rejected me, then certainly he couldn't have rejected Israel. I am living proof of this fact. I think this is true for a lot of our stories. Maybe this is something you would say, if you only knew me before I knew Jesus, it would be hard to believe. It would be hard for you to believe what I did or who I really was. But the fact that Jesus can save me is the truth that Jesus can save anybody. Or maybe you think the opposite of that. Man, if only you knew the things that I have done, or the things that make me think that I'm not worthy, that I'm too far removed, that God couldn't reach me. If only you knew what I've done. But I just want to say, if this is you, this is the furthest thing that is true. This is the furthest thing that is true of who you are, because no one is too far gone from God to be able to reach. No one is too far gone for God to be able to reach. This is certainly true of you. Paul was a living testimony that God had not rejected Israel. And he held on to this hope for the rest of his Jewish brothers and sisters because of this. So he moves on to a second example. In the second example, he reaches to the Old Testament, and he talks about the Old Testament prophet Elijah. And in this, what he's quoting from is, probably the most famous story of Elijah is he has this big battle with the prophets of Baal, and he wins. He prays, and fire falls down from heaven and consumes the altar, the water-soaked altar that Elijah had made. But after he wins, he's pushed into the wilderness. He runs to the desert. He hides in the cave, and he's lamenting before God because he says, God, they've literally killed everybody else. All of your prophets, everybody who's been faithful to you, like I'm the only one who is left. But in response to Elijah's laments, Paul says to him, he's like, I know it seems like you're all alone here, that you're the only one that's left, but he's like, trust me. There are 7,000 others who are still faithful to me, who have never bowed down to Baal or to any false idol. What he's saying is that there have always been and there always will be those who believe, who are faithful to me. You may feel like you are alone, but you are never alone. No matter how bleak it may seem, or no matter how much you may feel like we are alone in our faith, we're the only believer in our family. We're the only believer at our work or in our friend group, or maybe you're getting ready to go to college or thinking about college and where am I going to go and what happens if I'm the only Christian that I know when I get there. Or we see people who are leaving the faith, people that we love, or we're on social media and somebody else deconstructs and leaves the faith. But what we need to know is that there is a remnant. The scripture has this theme all throughout it, talking about a remnant of people. And the remnant is this symbol of hope. The remnant being the people who are always faithful to God, who always truly and fully belong to God, who are following after him. And the reason why that there is always going to be a remnant, why there always will be people that are faithful to God, leads us to the third point that Paul makes here about why God has not rejected Israel. And that is because of God's grace. So verses 5 and 6 say this. He's saying, just as it was in Elijah's day, Elijah thought he was alone, but he wasn't. It's the same today for a few of the people of Israel have remained faithful because of God's grace, his undeserved kindness in choosing them. And since it is through God's kindness, then it is not by their good works. For in that case, God's grace would not be what it really is, free and undeserved. So just as there was a remnant that Elijah was not aware of, that he did not know about, there is a remnant that Paul is saying that, man, it may seem like there's nobody else turning to Jesus, that I'm the only Jew who has done this, but he's saying that there is a remnant that we are unaware of, that you are unaware of. And the remnant exists. The remnant exists because of God's grace and God's faithfulness. Paul says that what guarantees that there will always be a faithful remnant to him is not because there's always going to be good people or a good group of people, but rather that there is always going to be God's grace and God's faithfulness. Those are always going to be present. And the existence of this remnant is solely because of God's free and undeserved gift. Lastly, there's one more argument that Paul makes about why God has not rejected Israel. And it's because Paul says Israel is the author of their own rejection. Verses 7 and 8 say, so this is the situation. Most of the people of Israel have not found the favor of God that they were looking for so earnestly. A few have, the ones that God has chosen, but the hearts of the rest were hardened. As the scriptures say, God has put them into a deep sleep. To this day, he has shut their eyes so that they do not see, and closed their ears so they do not hear. Israel was so earnestly trying to make themselves right with God in their own way. We talked about this last week in Romans chapter 9, but this is a theme that's all throughout the Old Testament and a part of Israel's story. They were trying to do things in their own way, but in so doing and trying to do things in their own way, they themselves rejected God. And the natural flow of rejecting God is getting a hardened heart. Tim Keller says it best this way when he says that rejection of God will lead to rejection from God. And one example of this is Pharaoh in the Old Testament, who he himself, the scripture says, he hardened his own heart against God. And then as a result of that, God hardened his heart all the more. Then we see this theme. There's a lot of themes we're talking about this morning. But there's another theme that God gives people over to their own desires. God gives people over to their own brokenness. God gives people over to their own hardness. This is what Romans chapter 1 talks through this. This is exactly what has happened to Israel. In the Old Covenant, Moses said, if you rebel against God, then what's going to happen is God is going to give you over to spiritual blindness. And this is what Paul is quoting in verse number 8 that we just read. And just as that happened in Moses, Isaiah prophesied the same thing, talking about, man, why is Israel not responding? Why is Israel not responding to God's kindness and his grace? And he's saying it's because their hearts are hardened and their eyes have been, they're spiritually blind. And Paul is saying these same things are happening to Israel now. A hardened heart is the natural response of making rejection a habit. Every time that we reject God, it's going to become easier to reject God again. Every time that we say no, it's going to be easier to say no again. No, no, no. And when our hearts become hard, we become spiritually insensitive. Hardness of heart comes from a deep place of spiritual pride. A heart that says, I don't need God. I'd rather follow the rule and the reign of my own kingdom. I've got this figured out. I know what I want to do, and I'm not going to submit to somebody else's way. Pride and self-centeredness will always lead, it's always going to lead to a heart that's hard. And the more that we choose this, the easier it's going to be to fall into this more and more. Our choices, they play such a significant part in who we are becoming. And either we cooperate with God in his work to make us more like Jesus, or we're going to harden ourselves to the work of God and the transformation that he wants to do within us and make that more difficult. I think it's important to ask the question, just to stop and ask the question, who am I becoming? Who is it that I am becoming? Am I living in such a way that my choices and my decisions and my actions are making my heart hard? Are they making me less compassionate? Are they making me less aware of the people around me, the needs around me, the way that Jesus wants to use me? Are they making me ultimately less like Jesus? Or are we, through our decisions and our actions, the way that we are living, are we growing in humility? Are we growing with a heart that's more willing to say, God, not my will be done, but yours? To surrender to him and become more gracious and become more passionate and become more loving, to become more like Jesus. Our choices and actions will either help conduct the work of God within us, or they can obstruct the work that God wants to do within us. And the majority of Israel, they rejected God. And so God hardened their hearts. And this is why Paul says that Israel themselves are the author of their own rejection. So Paul's clearly said it's not God. God is not the one who has rejected Israel. And this leads Paul to another follow-up question. So if Israel is the one who's rejected themselves, then is there any hope for them? Or have they gone like to the point of no return? Are they beyond the point of being recovered? And just like the first question, Paul says emphatically, like, absolutely not. That is not the case at all. Verse number 11 says, did God's people stumble and fall beyond recovery? Of course not. They were disobedient, so God made salvation available to the Gentiles. But he wanted his own people to become jealous and then to claim it for themselves. So the majority of Israel rejects Jesus, and Paul says that it's because of this rejection. It's because of Israel's rejection that salvation was then taken to the Gentiles. And so think about this. This is a fascinating thing to think through. If this didn't happen, what could have easily happened, like if the Jews had fully accepted Jesus as their Messiah, then it easily could have been concluded by the Gentiles that Christianity or following Jesus was just some sort of revival, renewal movement within Judaism, within Israel, and they would have believed that this wasn't for them. But it's because of Israel's rejection of the gospel. And this is, the thing that we can't get our mind around fully. In God's sovereign plan, that through their rejection, the apostles then took the good news of the gospel to the Gentiles. And this is the pattern that you see over and over again in the book of Acts, where apostles will go to a new city and they bring the message of the good news. And the first place that they go is to the synagogue. They go to the synagogue and they preach first the good news to the Jews. And what would happen is there would be some that would respond and who would join in, but the majority of the time, the Jews would say, no, thank you. They would reject it. And in their rejection, the apostles would then be sent out away from the synagogue and into the Gentiles, and they would preach the good news there. And there they would find a huge response of the Gentiles coming to faith in Jesus as a result. So Israel rejects the gospel. The Gentiles, because of that, accept the gospel because of their rejection. And then because of this, because of the Gentiles' acceptance, think about this. It's supposed to stir within Israel a jealousy that will eventually lead to their acceptance of the good news. This is what Paul says in verse 12. Now, if the Gentiles were enriched because the people of Israel turned down God's offer of salvation, think how much greater a blessing the world will share when they finally accept it. Gentiles are meant to stir jealousy within the hearts of Israel because Gentiles have received the fullness of God's blessings. What he had promised Israel centuries ago is now being fulfilled in something that is being attained and is supposed to stir within Israel, seeing the fulfillment of these promises and these blessings that will make them want to accept Jesus and receive it. Israel has fallen, but it's not past the point of being able to be recovered. Because with God, there's always hope. And some of the branches of Abraham's tree have been broken off, but they can always be grafted back in again. And it's this imagery of a tree and branches being broken off and things being grafted back in that Paul now turns to in verses 17 through 32. And Paul uses this imagery. So we've got an olive tree, and the olive tree stands for God's true people who truly belong to God, his olive tree, those who are his, and then this wild olive shoot represents the Gentiles. And I'm not Molly and I, we have a garden, we grow some plants, and we have tomatoes and peppers and other stuff like that. But this is way beyond my scope. Being able to fully understand what is happening here. I've never grafted a branch into a tree, but I did some reading this week, and it's actually really fascinating. And at least what Paul is saying here, at the very least, what he's trying to use with this image and this metaphor, which his people would have understood, in their agrarian society is that you could take a wild shoot of a branch, and you could, cut a branch from the tree, stick it in there, wrap it up, and it would actually fuse to the tree and become part of it. And not only would it become part of it, it would, receive the life from the tree. Like what the tree has, it now becomes a part of it. It is fully grafted into it, and it can now bear fruit. That's at least what's happening here. Some people think, though, what also is happening is that some farmers, I don't know, whoever's doing this, would graft in, they would take an olive tree that had stopped bearing fruits, that wasn't bearing fruit anymore. It wasn't dead, but it needed some help. And so you could take a branch and graft into it, and just merely by adding something new from the outside into it, it would start something new within the tree. It would spark something new within it, and the tree would come back to life again. It would start to bear fruit again. And so we have just this image, if this is what's happening here, it's a beautiful image of what Paul is trying to say is the relationship between the Jews and the Gentile in the gospel. This pattern that, the Jews reject the gospel, the Gentiles receive it, they're grafted into it, they start to bear fruit, and through that, it should spark jealousy or should spark a desire within the rest of the tree to start to bear fruit again, to receive the good news of the gospel. Paul keeps using this analogy. He's talking about the branches in the tree, but he turns his attention specifically to the Gentiles. And he starts talking to the branch that was grafted in. And he starts to warn them, hey, don't assume that you, because you've been grafted in here, that the branch are the one who supports the entire tree. If you need, Paul says, you are just a branch, you're not the root. And I was thinking, this would be a funny thing. If you need to, say something to somebody, to put them back in their place a little bit, you could just say, bro, you're just a branch. You are not the tree. You are just a branch. But Paul is trying to remind them, hey, you are not the one who is the source of life for everything here. There is something that is bigger than you, that was before you, that you have been grafted into. And why he's saying this to the Gentiles is because it was common for them to look down on the Jews around them. Either the Jews that were in the church with them or the Jews around them that had rejected the gospel. And there was this air of superiority that the Gentiles had over them. And they would, basically had this mindset hey, God kicked you guys out and made room for us. We're the ones who are important now. This is about us. But Paul is saying this could not be further from the truth. This is not what is happening. Paul is warning them from falling into pride. He said, don't forget the place of Israel. This tree that is here, it's a Jewish tree. We have a Jewish Bible. We know God because of the Jewish Messiah. There's so much that is built here on what God has done in and through his covenant people that we cannot forget about. And Paul is warning them, don't forget Israel's place. Don't look down on them or have contempt over them or believe that salvation is just for you. Don't let yourselves become conceited, just as Abraham's descendants had become. There's a difference between entitlement and assurance. Entitlement is formed out of a sense of pride of what is owed to me. It's a heart posture that says, I can do what I want. I'm safe. I can do what I want. There's enough grace to go around. I can live how I want. Or I can do what I want because of who I'm connected to or because of what I have. And this is the thing that Paul is saying happened to Israel. And Paul is saying, be careful not to let it happen to you. Our faith should never become a source of entitlement for us, but it can be and it should be a source of assurance. Assurance of faith specifically, it comes from a heart of humility, a place of gratitude that says, man, what I have received is not because of anything I have done to earn it this is just naturally mine because of who I am. No, it's something that I have because of God's mercy and his grace for me. And what we see here really are two different ways of living. The first way is this way of entitlement, a way of presumption, a way that leads only to pride and to arrogance and to eventually a hard heart. But the other way, the second way, is a way of humility. It's a way of gratitude that will lead to greater surrender and greater worship. And these are the choices that Paul tells them and puts before them, and it's the choices that we have now. Who are we becoming? What are the choices that we are making? And how are they either making us more like Jesus or less like Jesus? Paul says in verse 22, he says, notice how God is both kind and severe. He is severe towards those who disobeyed, but kind to you if you continue to trust in his kindness. But if you stop trusting, you also will be cut off. If we grow in pride, if we make a habit out of rejecting God and let our hearts become hardened, Paul is saying we can be cut off just like Israel was. There is a warning that Paul gives to us. We must be careful to stay humble before God and not let our pride harden us into a place of spiritual blindness. But there's deep comfort here as well, where God says, or Paul says, God is kind to you if you continue in your kindness, or continue in his kindness. Our call is to keep persevering in our faith and to always in everything to remain dependent fully upon God. This is something that we never graduate past. We can never outgrow or get to a point where we don't need to be fully dependent upon God. And so this is where we stay, in full dependence and in perseverance of faith. There's comfort for us, but verse 23 says that there's also hope for Israel, because Paul says that if Israel will just turn from their unbelief, then God has the power to graft them back into the tree. And so as a way to help the Gentiles not be conceited, to keep them from their pride, Paul reveals to them the mystery of God's mercy. And this is what he talks about in verses 25 to 32. And this is the mystery that Paul reveals. The mystery is that Israel's hard hearts will not last forever, and that one day they will be saved. Verse 26 and 27 say, and so all Israel will be saved, as the scriptures say, the one who rescues will come from Jerusalem, and he will turn Israel away from ungodliness. And this is my covenant with them, that I will take away their sins. I don't know exactly what it would look like, but I think this passage is clear that's saying that someday, at some point, there's going to be a revival among ethnic Jews. At some point, they're going to experience salvation that comes through Jesus. One day, Israel will place their hope in their true king and their true Messiah, and they will know the forgiveness and the salvation that has been given to the Gentiles. And so what do we do with this? How should we respond? I think there are a couple ways that we can. The first one is we should love them and we should pray for them and pray with the hope that our Jewish non-Christians around us, that they will come to know Jesus as their true king and their true Messiah. And this is because they are still God's chosen people and God still loves them. And this is what Paul says in verses 28 and 29, that even though many people of Israel are enemies to the good news, God still loves them because they are his chosen people and because God is always faithful to his promises. And a second thing that we can do, we have to remember that we were once people who rejected Jesus as well. We rejected Jesus and we were in desperate need of God's grace and God's mercy. Verse 30 and 31 say, once you Gentiles were rebels against God. We rejected him. But when the people of Israel rebelled against him, God was merciful to you. Now they are the rebels, and God's mercy has come to you so that they too will share in God's mercy. We have to remember, man, I first rejected Jesus, and he was merciful to me. And if he was merciful to me, if he was kind to me, then he can reach anyone. People with hardened hearts, Jew and Gentile alike, anyone around me. Nobody is too hard. Nobody is too far gone for God to reach. As we begin to close here and jump into the final part of this passage, I just want to think back again to the sections in Romans. We have the section we're currently in of chapters 9, 10, and 11. Think through how Paul began this whole part. Paul is saying, man, my heart, I want everybody to know how deeply loved they are. My heart is to see as many people come to know Jesus as possible. My heart breaks for my brothers and sisters in from Jewish heritage who don't know this. But then he continues to work through it and talking about God's sovereignty. And he talks about God's love and God's faithfulness and God's desire for everybody, Jew and Gentile alike, to know what his mercy is like. And all of this leads Paul to do one thing. It leads Paul to do one thing, and that is to worship. He's working through all of this. He's talking about how God has been at work, even though he doesn't fully understand it or fully comprehend it. God has been at work, and he still is at work. And he ends chapter 11 in this spontaneous burst of praise to God. And our bottom line for today is this praise that Paul proclaims. Verse 33, Paul says, "Oh, how great are God's riches in wisdom and knowledge. How impossible is it for us to understand his decisions and his ways? For who can know the Lord's thoughts? Who knows enough to give him advice? And who has given him so much that God needs to pay it back? For everything comes from him and exists by his power and is intended for his glory. All glory to him forever. Amen." Paul's response to worship is our call to action as well. The opposite of a hardened heart, this is, as I've been going through this passage this week, these are the two options, the two ways, the things that keep coming up is, the way of a hardened heart and the way of a heart that is soft and open to what God is. The opposite of a hard heart is a humble heart. And this is the posture of what Paul's worship looks like, and is the posture of our worship as well. We praise the one who understands the things that we cannot understand, the one who never needs counsel from us, and the one who could never be indebted to us. In the good news of Jesus, God has shown us kindness and mercy. And it has nothing to do with how great we are or what we've done to deserve it, but it has everything to do with how great God is in his love for us. So church, if we hear God speak today, if we hear God speak this week, may we not harden our hearts, but may we respond in worship that is marked with humility and surrender and gratitude for all that God has done for us. To God, the one who has been unbelievably merciful to us, to him alone be the glory today. Let's pray. God, we thank you for your kindness and your mercy that you have shown to us through your Son, Jesus. The life that we have been given that we don't deserve. God, we praise you. God, the places in us that are where our hearts are hard, that we're unresponsive, where we might be spiritually blind, God, I pray that you would do your work, the only work that you can do, and help us to see. Soften our hearts. The places where we say, my will be done, God, would you say, give us the ability to say, your will be done. Bring us to a place of surrender, of deep humility, and trust in you. And God, may our hearts always be in a posture of worship before you. We pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen.